We're now going to consider how to fix the presidential nomination system. Not to be confused with the Electoral College, this is the system called the primaries and the caucuses, which exist to select the candidates for the presidential elections. So first of all, I'd like to consider what are the current problems with the primary system. While you think about that, the whole point of this video is to be able to explain and evaluate the different suggestions put forward for reforming the primary system. So why was the primary system introduced? Now, before 1968, few states held primaries as the delegates were chosen by the local parties, either through a caucus or just through the party dignitaries selecting one individual to go and represent them at the National Party Convention. Now, in 1968, this method fell apart to some extent. The Democrat Party had chosen Hubert Humphreys, the current vice president, as their candidate, and he was resoundingly beaten by Nixon in the election. Now, many Democrats argued they should have run with the anti-war Eugene McCarthy, who had a lot more support from the grassroots people and across the country. So what they did was they set up a commission named after the two Democrats who chaired it, Senator George McGovern and Representative Donald Fraser, to look into the issues raised, and they suggested the introduction of a primary system to be more democratic and choose better candidates across the board. And both parties took this on board and introduced it for the next elections. So what impact did the reforms have? First of all, there were far more primaries. In 1968, there were only 17 Democratic primaries. Now there are 43, with every state having some form of election to choose their delegates. It also means there's far more voters. 60 million people voted in the primaries in 2008, whereas in 1968, the few primaries they had only raised 12 million voters. It also means there are far more candidates, rather than the two, perhaps three, that used to stand for nomination for the presidential candidate. There were actually 15 candidates in 2008. And this links into our next point, that it opened up the process to outsiders. It's very easy to see that Obama, Clinton, Carter, George Bush Jr. and several others were outsiders to the political elites to some extent. And so actually, by having the primaries, often these outsiders got to have more of a chance and a say. However, it also means that there's far more money is spent due to a focus on these early elections, and there's a greater focus on the media and the importance of the TV in giving airtime to these candidates. So overall, democratizing of the process was a good idea, but it has now become expensive, overlong and media dominated, with a great deal of emphasis placed on the early states, which is known as front loading. So what different reforms have been put forward? First of all, there is the National Primary Plan. Secondly, a rotating regional primary plan. Thirdly, there's the backloading or Delaware plan. And lastly, there's a plan put forward for a pre-primary mini convention. So first, we're going to focus on the National Primary Plan. Now, this is in many ways the simplest, but really the most ambitious suggestion, because it would cause a massive change. And it is simply to have a one-day national primary, where all states voted for who they wanted to be their presidential nominee on the same day. Now, this would cut down the seemingly endless cycle of primaries to being all on one day, and would take away an advantage from being first in the primary calendar. However, it would mean that the candidates would have less chance to meet the country, as there would be less opportunity for face-to-face meetings, which happens due to the drawn-out nature of the primaries. It would also mean most of the campaign would be on TV, and actually would probably place more emphasis on the media. And possibly it would also mean outsiders have less chance of winning nomination, as candidates like Hillary Clinton, who already had a large amount of name recognition in 2008, would be able to win on that one day alone, whereas someone like Barack Obama, who had to build up momentum to win the nomination, would have a lot less chance. The second suggestion is the rotating regional primary. Now, this is an idea that's been around for a while and was actually introduced as a reform in the Senate in 2007, but it got nowhere. The plan is to divide the USA into 4 equal regions who will take it in turn to hold regional primaries. So the country will be split into north, east, south and west, roughly similar amounts of states and population in each region. The order of who would go first would rotate to preserve fairness, and they would happen 1 month after each other. This plan allows Iowa and New Hampshire to still go first before these other regional primaries, but in general would stop front-loading and would make sure the campaign was genuinely competitive to the end, as a quarter of the votes would not come in till the very end. But people criticised it because candidates from the first region would benefit, as their candidate would get presumably the majority of the votes in that first region and would get a certain amount of momentum, and it still preserves Iowa and New Hampshire's slightly bizarre influence on the elections. There's another variation of this plan, which is to have the same system but have the order decided by a lottery just before the primary started, so there was a certain more amount of randomness to it. A slightly different plan is the backloading or Delaware plan. Now, under this plan, states with the smallest population would vote first, and then in order of increasing population. So, for example, states like Wyoming, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Hawaii, Idaho would all be in the first group. Then a second group in Nebraska, New Mexico, the slightly larger states. Then a third group, including Indiana, Tennessee, Missouri, of the even larger states. And lastly, the really big states like New York, Texas, California, and Florida would vote at the end. Would mean that the influence of the smaller states would be preserved and allow outsiders to compete in the cheaper, smaller states first to see if they had an influence or a say over the election. Would also ensure that there was genuine competition till the end, as the majority of votes would be cast towards the end of the process. A final suggestion for reform would be the pre-primary mini-convention. Now, this is slightly different, as rather than reforming the primaries, the idea is to focus on the people standing in them and make sure that they were of a high enough quality to be worthwhile to stand in the primaries. So before the primaries took place, they would hold a convention of party dignitaries. At the convention, the party would in some way choose 2 to 3 candidates who they felt would be best to run in the primaries, so preserving the influence of the party but still allowing a more democratic primary process to go ahead. It would mean that the party could focus on the most supported individuals and eliminate outsiders early. It would also mean that there would be more peer review in the process, meaning that suitable candidates would be chosen. So if we think back to 2012, it would mean, for example, that the more serious candidates like Mitt Romney, Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich would get through this process, while the more extreme candidates like Herman Cain, Michelle Bachmann, Buddy Roemer, Ron Paul and Rick Perry would be excluded early on and not waste people's time. So, will reform happen for 2016? The short answer is no. Most of these reforms would require the 50 state parties of each party to agree to a new system. The rotating regional primary was actually put forward in 2007 and got nowhere. So it's very unlikely that major change will happen soon. So in summary, the primaries were meant to open up the process for selecting the presidential nominee and make it more democratic. Now they have increased turnout and have meant that outsiders can be selected, but it's argued that the process is now dominated by money and the media. And there are major concerns about the length and the suitability of the primary process. So several plans to reform have been introduced, including the national primary, the rotating regional primary, including the lottery approach to selecting who goes first, backloading or the Delaware plan, and the pre-primary mini-convention. However, it is unlikely that any of these are likely to be implemented soon. So finally, what do you think? Do you think the system needs reform or not? And what reform do you feel would have the most impact, and why? This has been a Flip Your History video. More information and more videos are available on TES if you search Flip Your History, or for more information about Flip Learning and my Flip Learning journey, go to Twitter at Flip Your History or my blog flipyourhistory.wordpress.com. Thank you for listening.